Women settle for men like you when their first choice doesn't work out, my girlfriend said during an argument while comparing me to men she followed online every day. I smiled and walked away forever. Months later, she heard someone describe me as the opportunity she never should have lost. Women settle for men like you when their first choice doesn't work out. She said it casually, like she was commenting on the weather, like it wasn't a sentence designed to hollow a person out from the inside. I remember standing in the kitchen doorway, a dish towel in my hand, watching her scroll through her phone with one leg crossed over the other on the couch. She didn't even look up, and that, somehow, made it worse. I didn't yell. I didn't fire something back. I just stood there for a moment, feeling the full weight of what she'd said settle into the room like smoke. At the time, I thought it was simply another cruel comment in a season that had accumulated too many of them. Months later, she'd be standing in a crowded room, listening to someone describe me in a way that would make her quietly put down her drink and go very still. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up, because the story of what Daphne said that night didn't begin that night. It began much earlier, in smaller moments, quieter dismissals, in the way a person can slowly stop seeing you while still sitting across from you at dinner every evening. I didn't see it happening. That's the part that still bothers me when I let myself think about it. I was paying attention to the wrong things. I was watching whether she was happy, whether I was doing enough, whether the relationship was moving in a direction we'd both be proud of. I wasn't watching the way she looked at me when I talked about my goals. I wasn't watching the slow shift in her eyes when other men came up in conversation. I wasn't watching the phone screen. She angled slightly away from me without ever seeming to realize she was doing it. I didn't realize it then, but that season changed everything. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. I was 34 at the time. Daphne and I had been together for 2 years and 8 months. We lived in the same city, a large metro area on the East Coast, the kind of place where everyone is always in motion and nobody ever seems quite satisfied with where they've landed. I worked in operations consulting for a mid-sized firm. Solid work. Not glamorous, but genuinely demanding. The kind of role where a mistake on a Thursday afternoon shows up in someone's budget report by Friday morning. Daphne worked in marketing for a lifestyle brand. We had our own apartments, about 12 minutes apart by car, and we split our time between them the way people do when they're serious but haven't yet made the official leap. To most people looking in, we were a normal couple doing fine. And for a long time, I believed that too. The comparisons started small. They always do. The first one I can remember came about 8 months in. We were watching something on TV, one of those entrepreneur interview series, and a man in his early 30s was explaining how he'd built a logistics company from a garage operation into something with 70 employees and 3 distribution centers. Daphne watched with total focus. The kind of focus she rarely gave anything else in the room, including me. When the segment ended, she turned to me and said, "Why don't you think bigger?" I told her I did think big. I told her I had a 5-year plan, that I was building towards something, that the consulting work was a foundation, not a destination. She nodded the way people do when they've already stopped listening. I told myself it was just a passing comment. I told myself she was inspired by what she'd watched and was projecting that energy outward. Looking back, I should have paid attention. The comparisons didn't stay on television. They migrated to her phone. Daphne had always been active on social media. That was just part of who she was, and I had no problem with it. But somewhere in the middle of our second year, the accounts she followed shifted. She started spending hours with men who documented every stage of their wealth online. Men posting about morning routines and cold plunges and 7-figure milestones and penthouse views. Men whose entire identities were curated to project one message. I am extraordinary. Everyone around me is ordinary. Your current life is not enough. She never said that last part out loud, but I started to feel it. My coworker Conrad noticed before I was willing to admit it. We were grabbing lunch near the office, and I'd mentioned something Daphne had said the previous week about a man she followed online who had apparently sold a startup for a number she'd repeated to me with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious experiences. Conrad put his fork down. "She tells you this stuff regularly?" "Sometimes," I said. "Does she follow it up with anything? Like, what she's building? What she wants to do?" I thought about it. Not really. He didn't say anything else. He just picked his fork back up and looked out the window. That wasn't the last conversation about it, and it wasn't the last comparison. There was a night about 3 months before everything ended that I still think about occasionally. We were at a dinner party at Emmett's apartment. a mutual friend who hosted gatherings every couple of months with a rotating mix of people from different industries. I got into a conversation with a woman named Evelyn, a client of a firm I'd recently done project work for. She was describing a presentation I'd done, telling people at the table how I'd identified a structural inefficiency in her company's supply chain that no one else had caught in 2 years of audits. I remember she used the phrase, quietly brilliant. She said, "He's the kind of person who does the work before you even know the work needed doing." I was a little embarrassed by it, honestly. I thanked her and redirected the conversation. But I noticed Daphne from across the table. She wasn't smiling. She had a particular expression on her face that I'd started to recognize. Not pride, not warmth, something closer to irritation. Later, in the car, she was quiet for most of the drive home. Then, near the end, she said, "Evelyn seemed really impressed with you." I said, "She was being generous." Daphne said, "Yeah, just that. Yeah." And something in the way she said it told me that Evelyn's admiration hadn't made Daphne see me differently. It had made her compare the gap between who I was and who she decided she wanted. I told myself I was reading too much into a single word. At the time, I ignored the warning. My best friend Pierce had been watching all of this longer than anyone. Pierce and I had been friends since our mid-20s, the kind of friendship built on honesty and enough history together to survive uncomfortable conversations. He met Daphne a handful of times and was always cordial, but he had a way of listening carefully when I talked about her that I eventually recognized as concern. One evening, we were at a bar near his office, and I was telling him about an argument we'd had after I declined to attend some launch event she'd wanted to go to because I had an early client call the next morning. She'd called me unambitious. She'd said that people who really wanted to build something would find a way to do both. Pierce listened until I was done. Then he said, "Does she ever talk about what she's building?" I paused. "She's working on a brand campaign for—" "No," Pierce said. "Not work. Her. Does she ever talk about her own ambitions the same way she talks about yours falling short?" I sat with that for a moment. The honest answer was no. The comparisons were always outward. Always directed at the distance between me and some other man she'd found on a screen. Her own goals were rarely discussed with the same intensity. "I don't know what to do with that," I said. Pierce looked at his drink. "I know. I want to be clear about something. I wasn't perfect in that relationship. I worked long hours and sometimes brought that weight home. There were evenings I was distracted when I should have been present. There were conversations I shortened when they deserved more time. I'm not telling this story to paint myself as blameless, but I was trying. I was genuinely, consistently trying. And what I was slowly coming to understand, though I resisted it for months longer than I should have, was that trying wasn't the problem. The problem was that no amount of trying would ever close the distance between who I was and who existed in Daphne's imagination. Because that person wasn't real. He was assembled from social media profiles, curated highlight reels, carefully lit photos and edited captions designed to manufacture aspiration. And I was a real person, with ordinary mornings and imperfect timing and a career that moved at the pace of actual work rather than viral announcements. I could never compete with the fiction. I just hadn't fully accepted that yet. The final months accelerated in a way that felt, in retrospect, almost inevitable. There was the evening she showed me an account she'd been following, a man in his early 30s who apparently flew private, documented charity work in 3 countries, and posted sunrise workouts from rooftops of buildings in cities I'd never visited. She scrolled through his feed while I sat next to her on the couch, and she said, almost to herself, "This is what real ambition looks like." I asked, calmly, whether she knew anything about this person beyond what he chose to post. She looked at me with something that wasn't quite contempt, but was close enough to it that my chest tightened. "I know what I see," she said. "You see what he shows you," I said. She put her phone down, and we moved past it. But it didn't leave the room. There was the dinner where she told me, in front of her friend Celeste, that she'd been thinking about what her life would look like if she'd made different choices. Celeste went very quiet. I excused myself to get a glass of water. When I came back, Daphne was laughing about something else, and Celeste was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite name. Afterward, Celeste texted me. Just one line. "She doesn't know what she has." I'm sorry. I thanked her and didn't respond after that. And then came the night it ended. We'd been arguing about something that had started small, the way most serious arguments do. I no longer remember the original trigger. Something about plans that changed, or a comment she'd made, or the tone of something said in passing that neither of us was willing to let go of. It had escalated through the usual stages. Voices rising. Old grievances resurfacing. The architecture of 2 years of collected frustration cracking open all at once. And then she said it. Women settle for men like you when their first choice doesn't work out. The room went quiet. Not because I went silent, but because something inside me did. Some last remaining effort to rationalize, to extend generosity, to find a version of events where this was still fixable. It stopped. Just stopped. Like a machine that had finally been given the permission to power down. I looked at her. She was still angry, still flush with the momentum of the argument, still waiting for me to fight back or apologize or do whatever it was she expected me to do. I didn't do any of those things. I set down what I was holding. I picked up my jacket from the back of the chair. I walked to the door. Where are you going? She said. Home, I said. We're not done talking. I am, I said. And I left. I want to be honest about what the weeks after that looked like. They weren't cinematic. There was no immediate clarity, no sunrise run where everything suddenly made sense. There were evenings I sat with the quiet of my own apartment and felt the full weight of 3 years of something ending. There were moments I second-guessed myself. There were nights I almost called her, not out of wanting her back, but out of the strange grief that comes from losing something familiar even when it was hurting you. I didn't call. Pierce checked in regularly. He never said, I told you so. He just showed up, physically and otherwise, the way good friends do. My mentor Griffin, who I'd known since early in my career, took me to lunch one afternoon about a month after the breakup. I hadn't told him much, just that a long relationship had ended and I was recalibrating. Griffin was in his late 50s, had built and sold 2 companies, and had a way of saying important things without making them feel like lessons. He said, the people who tell you you're ordinary are often the ones who feel most threatened by the possibility that you aren't. I didn't respond immediately. I just let that sit. The next several months moved with a kind of quiet momentum I hadn't expected. I'd been working on a proposal for an operational restructuring project for a mid-sized logistics company. It was the biggest scope I'd taken on independently. I had been building the framework for it for nearly a year, refining it, stress testing the numbers, anticipating objections. 3 weeks after the breakup, I presented it. The director, Mason, sat across from me with a small team and listened for 40 minutes without interrupting. At the end, he looked at the senior manager beside him, a man named Brooks who I'd worked with briefly before, and said, this is exactly the kind of thinking we've been trying to find. They approved the project 2 weeks later. It was the largest independent engagement of my career. I didn't post about it. I didn't tell anyone except Pierce and Griffin. I just went back to work. There were other things happening in parallel that I gave more attention to because I finally had the time and energy to do so. I started training consistently again, something I'd let fall away in the last year of the relationship. I reconnected with a few old friends I drifted from, including my college friend Claire, who was building something in the nonprofit space and had a perspective on ambition that had nothing to do with social media follower counts. I spent more time with my neighbor Parker, who was quietly one of the most interesting people I'd met in years, a former academic who had moved into architectural consulting and who had strong opinions about everything and backed them all up. My world got quieter and fuller at the same time. I wasn't performing recovery. I was just living. What was happening in Daphne's world during those months, I only know through fragments. Emmett mentioned once, carefully, that she'd been having a difficult stretch. Celeste, who had remained loosely in touch with me, said something similar. From what I gathered, Daphne had pursued one of the kinds of connections she'd spent our relationship idealizing. Someone who matched the profile she'd built in her imagination. Flashy, visibly successful, projecting ambition with perfect consistency. It hadn't gone well. From what I understood, the reality of that person had been substantially different from the image. The private flights were sponsored posts. The charity work was content. The rooftop mornings were staged. I didn't feel satisfaction hearing that. I want to be honest about that too. I just felt a quiet, distant recognition. Daphne's sister Vivian called me once, about 4 months after the breakup. She'd always been straightforward, more direct than Daphne in most ways. She said, I don't know what my sister was thinking. I want you to know I never agreed with how she treated you. I thanked her. She said, she's starting to see it. I don't know if that matters to you. I thought about how to answer that honestly. I hope she's doing well, I said. I genuinely mean that. Vivian was quiet for a moment. You know, she said, that's exactly the problem. You were never the person she described. We didn't talk long after that, but the conversation stayed with me. The project with Mason's company concluded in month 6. The results were significant enough that Mason began referring me to his network. One of those referrals came from a man named Sawyer, a contact who operated in the intersection of operations consulting and early-stage venture work. Sawyer introduced me to a few emerging companies that needed the kind of structural thinking I'd been developing for years. My work shifted. The scope expanded. A recruiter named Adler contacted me about an advisory role I hadn't applied for, but apparently had been recommended for by 3 separate people. I took meetings. I stayed deliberate. I wasn't chasing recognition. But recognition had apparently started paying attention on its own. The event where everything converged happened in early autumn. It was an industry gathering, the kind of professional conference that doubles as a networking event, held in one of the downtown hotels with wide corridors and open bars, and the ambient noise of 300 people convincing each other they were exactly where they were supposed to be. I was there because Griffin had asked me to join him. He was speaking on a panel about operational scaling in the second half of a company's growth arc. I wasn't there to be seen. I was there because Griffin was someone I showed up for. I didn't know Daphne would be there. Her company's marketing work apparently intersected with some of the brand-side sponsors of the event. I learned this afterward. At the time, I didn't see her for the first 2 hours. The moment happened near the end of the evening. Griffin had just finished a panel conversation that had gone well. Afterward, a small group had gathered around him, and I was nearby, speaking with an event host named Harper and an attorney named Bennett who I'd met once before through a mutual connection. A woman named Genevieve, who I knew casually as a mutual friend, joined our group and started telling the others about a project she'd heard about, not knowing I was standing there. She was describing the logistics restructuring work I'd done for Mason's company. She didn't know all the details, but she knew enough. She said, "There's a consultant in the city who basically rebuilt the entire distribution architecture for a logistics firm that had been losing money for 3 consecutive years. They turned profitable inside 8 months. The CEO talks about it constantly." Harper said, "Do you know who it is?" Genevieve said, "I know him, actually. He's one of those people who just quietly does the work and somehow ends up being the person everyone wishes they'd gotten to first." She paused. Then she said, "Honestly, he's the kind of person who is the opportunity that most people realize they missed only after they've already missed it." I was about to say something when I caught a movement in my peripheral vision. I turned slightly. Daphne was standing about 8 feet away, at the edge of a nearby group. Her back had been partially turned, but she'd heard. I know she had because of the way her posture changed. A barely visible stillness. The kind that happens when something lands somewhere too accurate to absorb in real time. She didn't turn around. She didn't look at me. I let the moment pass. I turned back to Harper and said something about the logistics industry's resistance to structural change, and the conversation moved on. I didn't speak to Daphne that night. I saw her once more, from across the room, near the end of the event. She was standing with her colleague, holding a drink she wasn't finishing, looking at nothing in particular. I felt something when I saw her. Not anger, not satisfaction. Something more complicated and quieter than either. Something close to the feeling of understanding a story fully for the first time only at its ending. I said goodbye to Griffin. I found my coat. I left. Celeste messaged me 2 days later. She said, "Daphne called me the night of that event. She was upset. She wouldn't tell me everything, but I think something happened that made her really sit with some things." I read the message twice. Then I put my phone down and went back to the proposal I was working on. There was no response I needed to give. There was no conversation that would have served either of us. There was nothing left to say that the silence hadn't already said more clearly. I spoke to Pierce a week after the event. We were at the same bar we'd been at the night I'd told him about the argument over the launch event, the one where she'd called me unambiguous. I told him about the conference, about Genevieve's words, about seeing Daphne across the room. Pierce listened. Then he said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it for a long moment. "Like something finished," I said. "Not in a bad way. Just finished." He nodded. He ordered another round. We talked about other things for the rest of the night. I want to end this with something honest rather than something tidy. I didn't walk away from that relationship because I calculated a better outcome. I walked away because I finally understood something I'd been refusing to accept for too long. You cannot build a life with someone who sees you primarily as a compromise. You cannot pour energy into closing a gap that exists only in someone else's imagination. And you cannot measure your worth through someone else's constantly shifting benchmark of what worth is supposed to look like. Daphne wasn't a villain. She was a person who had let a curated world convince her that real life would always fall short of its images. That the men who documented their success online were more real than the man sitting next to her. That visible was the same thing as valuable. She was wrong about that. But being wrong about something doesn't make a person cruel. It just makes them unavailable in a particular way. And at some point, a person has to choose to stop waiting for the unavailable to become present. The work kept moving. The advisory role materialized. Griffin and I began collaborating on a framework for early-stage operational design that we planned to publish in the spring. Parker and I started a habit of Saturday morning conversations over coffee that became one of the most consistently interesting parts of my week. Claire texted occasionally with updates on her nonprofit work that reminded me, regularly, what real ambition looked like, the kind that builds something and doesn't broadcast it. My life had a shape that felt like mine. Not aspirational. Not performed. Mine. I heard through Emmett, about 8 months after the conference, that Daphne had made some changes. She'd stepped back from some of the accounts she'd been following for years. She was spending more time with her sister Vivian. She was quieter about the comparisons. Whether that was growth or just a different kind of searching, I don't know. I hoped it was growth. I meant that the same way I'd meant it when I told Vivian I hoped Daphne was doing well. Without bitterness. Without theater. Just genuinely. Because moving forward doesn't require the people you left behind to be doing poorly. It just requires you to no longer need them to validate the direction you chose. She spent years chasing people who looked extraordinary, only to realize she had walked away from someone who actually was.